the oxen lurch. A cart jolts on the rough ground near the threshing floor of Nacon, and one man does what almost anyone would do. He throws out his hand to steady the sacred chest before it falls. In that instant, Uzzah crosses a line that Israel had been warned about for generations. And the story turns hard. The Ark of the Covenant is not allowed to be treated like cargo. It is not furniture, not treasure, not even merely a relic of national memory. Why would a single touch carry such weight? Why would one object gather around itself so much fear, hope, longing, and judgment? To answer that, the story has to move backward, into the wilderness, into the smoke and silence that followed Sinai. Israel did not first meet the Ark in a stone temple or a settled kingdom. It belonged to a people still learning how to live after slavery. Egypt had shaped their bodies with forced labor, and their minds with the logic of empire. A slave wakes when ordered, marches when ordered, builds what another man desires, and learns that power lives in palaces, armies, and storehouses. But the God who brought Israel out of Egypt was not another pharaoh with a larger throne. At Sinai, the people encountered a holiness that could not be managed. There was thunder, cloud, trumpet blast, fire on the mountain, and a warning not to come too near. Freedom from Egypt had not erased fear. It had simply changed its object. In that setting, the instructions of Exodus 25 arrive with striking precision. The ark is to be made of acacia wood, overlaid inside and out with pure gold. It is to have rings at its feet and poles for carrying. It is to be crowned with a molding of gold and covered by a lid of solid gold, the mercy seat, with cherubim overshadowing it. The measurements are exact. The materials are named. The method of transport is built into the design itself. This is one of the first lessons the Ark teaches. Holiness in the biblical world is not vague. It comes with boundaries. It asks for obedience in detail. That detail mattered because the Ark was never meant to be admired for craftsmanship alone. The biblical text presents it as the place where God would meet Moses and speak from above the mercy seat, from between the cherubim. In the ancient Near East, kings placed symbols of their rule in temples, and conquered peoples stored treaties in sacred spaces as witnesses to covenant obligations. The Ark stands close to that world and yet remains distinct from it. It is not an image of God. Israel is forbidden to make one. No statue sits on top of the chest. The cherubim form a throne without a visible king. The absence is itself part of the meaning. Israel's God cannot be reduced to an idol, yet he chooses to place his name, his authority, and his presence in the midst of a camp of former slaves. That is why the Ark can never be described as a lucky object or a magical device, even if later readers have tried to explain it in mechanical terms. The Bible is not interested in the Ark as technology. It is interested in the Ark as a dangerous meeting point between divine holiness and human life. Gold and wood matter, but not because they create power in themselves. The power belongs to the God whose covenant the Ark embodies. When the text later describes judgment falling on those who handle it carelessly, it does not explain the event in scientific language. It explains it morally and theologically. Israel is dealing with a reality that cannot be approached on human terms. So Uzzah's outstretched hand only makes sense when placed against that older wilderness story. He was not reaching toward a box. He was reaching into a sphere of holiness that had always come with law, memory, and warning. And the tragedy becomes sharper, because Uzzah was not a foreign invader mocking Israel's God. He was an Israelite participating in a national celebration. That is often how the biblical narrative works. Judgment falls not only in moments of open rebellion, but in moments when familiarity dulls reverence. The holy becomes common by habit, and habit invites disaster. Before there was Uzzah, before there was Jerusalem, before David danced and before Solomon built walls of cedar and stone, there was a command in the desert. Build this chest, carry it this way. Place within it the testimony of the covenant. Let it stand at the heart of worship and at the edge of danger. The ark begins there, not as a piece of pageantry, but as a sign that Israel's freedom would not be secured by escaping one master and doing as it pleased. Freedom would mean living under the presence of a God who was merciful, near, and utterly unlike the gods of empire. That is a gift. It is also a burden. The rest of the ark's story unfolds inside that tension. Chapter 2. The people who received the command to build the ark were camped in a harsh landscape, not in a royal workshop. The wilderness of Sinai was not a place of abundance. It offered heat, wind, rock, uncertainty, and distance. Yet in that unpromising setting, the book of Exodus describes a burst of ordered construction. The tabernacle and its furnishings would become a portable sanctuary, a holy center for a people still on the move. That is important. Israel did not wait for stability before learning worship. The sanctuary traveled with them, because the covenant itself had to shape them before they reached any permanent land. The ark stood at the center of that project. But the command did not fall on Israel as a test of artistic genius. It fell as a test of obedience. In the ancient world, sacred architecture often advertised kingly wealth and imperial reach. Great temples displayed the resources of states and the power of dynasties. Israel had no such dynasty yet. It had no settled capital. What it had, according to Exodus, were gifts gathered from the people. Gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, dyed fabrics, skins, wood, oil, spices, and precious stones. The narrative goes out of its way to say the offerings came from willing hearts. That detail matters because it shifts the work from extraction to devotion. Egypt had taken labor by force. The tabernacle was built by free offering. The text also introduces Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and Oholiab of the tribe of Dan. Bezalel is said to be filled with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and craftsmanship. This is one of the Bible's earliest portraits of skilled labor as a divine calling. The craftsman is not an afterthought standing below prophets and priests. He becomes essential to the shaping of holy space. In later ages, readers sometimes romanticized Bezalel as if he worked in isolation, a genius in a tent. The biblical picture is broader. He leads others, he teaches, he organizes a communal labor force. Skill is honored, but skill remains under command. No artist is invited to improvise a holier design than the one given. Acacia wood, likely drawn from hardy desert trees, was well suited to a mobile people. It was dense, durable, resistant to decay and insects. Gold, by contrast, carried associations of value, purity, splendor, and sacred honor across the ancient world. To overlay the wood inside and out was to unite strength and glory, endurance and radiance. The ark was not huge. Its modest size is part of its force. Something small enough to be carried on poles would become the focal point of national life. In biblical thought, God's greatness does not require a colossal image. A few cubits of wood and gold are enough if the covenant they hold is real. The mercy seat on top deserves careful attention. English readers often hear the word and think first of comfort or softness, but the Hebrew term points more directly to a place of atonement. Here, the blood of sacrifice would be applied on the Day of Atonement described in Leviticus 16. Here, in priestly theology, sin and holiness meet under a ritual that neither denies guilt nor leaves it unresolved. The cherubim above the lid are not decorative angels in the later sentimental sense. In the symbolic world of the Old Testament, cherubim belong to the throne imagery of divine majesty and guarded sacred space. They recall Eden after the expulsion, where cherubim bar the way back. They appear woven into tabernacle curtains. Their presence around the ark announces access, but guarded access. Then there are the poles. The text insists they remain in the rings. That detail sounds minor until later history proves it is not. The ark is meant to be carried without direct touch. Holiness requires mediation. Israel learns this lesson through its priesthood, its sacrificial system, and its sanctuary architecture. The closer one comes to the divine presence, the more carefully one must come. Modern readers sometimes hear only harshness in such boundaries, but in the biblical imagination, the boundary is itself a mercy. It prevents casual destruction. It teaches that God's nearness is not the same as domestication. What went into the ark also matters, though the traditions are not always presented in exactly the same way at every stage of Scripture. At the core were the tablets of the covenant, the testimony given to Moses. Hebrews later mentions the jar of manna and Aaron's rod that budded, and those objects are certainly linked to the sanctuary tradition. The precise placement and period can be discussed, but the symbolic force is clear. Law, provision, and priestly authority converge around the ark. Israel's life with God is not built on private feeling. It is built on remembered commands, remembered rescue, and ordered worship. By the time the ark is complete, the tabernacle project has already taught Israel something larger than craftsmanship. A free people must learn that the presence of God is not sustained by enthusiasm alone. It requires pattern, gift, restraint, and memory. In a camp where thousands moved, argued, feared, and hoped together, the ark would become the still point no one could ignore. It was precious, but never available, near but never casual, carried by men, yet never under their control. Chapter 3. Once the ark enters Israel's life, it begins to organize space around itself. The tabernacle is not arranged at random. Court, tent, holy place, and most holy place form concentric degrees of access. The farther inward one moves, the fewer people may go. The ark rests in the innermost chamber, behind the veil, in darkness thick with meaning. This arrangement says as much as any speech. The God of Israel dwells among his people, but he is not absorbed into the crowd. Nearness and distance exist together. That tension shaped the work of the priests and Levites. The priests descended from Aaron, handled sacrifice, and approached the altar. The Levites more broadly served the sanctuary, guarded it, dismantled it, carried its parts when the camp moved, and maintained the discipline of sacred order. Even among the Levites, duties were divided by clan. Numbers 4 makes clear that the Kohathites were entrusted with carrying the most sacred objects, including the ark, but only after the priests had covered them. They were not to touch the holy things, or even gaze on them uncovered, lest they die. These warnings are not side notes. They explain the dread that later stories assume. When the camp broke and moved, the ark could go before the people. Numbers 10 preserves a memory of Moses saying, "Rise up, O Lord, when the ark set out, and return, O Lord, when it rested." Whether those words were always spoken in that exact form, the tradition reveals how Israel understood the movement. The ark was not a banner for national pride. It signified the Lord going before the tribes. In a desert world where travel meant vulnerability, orientation mattered. Water sources, tribal order, and survival could hinge on who moved first and where. The ark at the front of the procession told Israel that its journey was covenantal before it was geographic. This helps explain the dramatic role the ark plays in the crossing of the Jordan in Joshua 3. The priests bearing it step into the river first. The waters are said to stand up, and the people cross on dry ground. The narrative is overtly theological. Just as the sea opened at the Exodus, so the river opens at the entry into the land. Israel is meant to see continuity between Moses and Joshua, between liberation and inheritance. The ark is central because the point is not military daring or tribal migration. The point is that the God who brought the people out now brings them in. The same is true at Jericho, though in a different key. In Joshua 6, the ark circles the city with priests, trumpets, and armed men. It is a strange procession if judged by ordinary siege tactics. Jericho is not won through brilliant engineering or prolonged assault in the way later empires would take fortified cities. The story makes victory depend on obedience to a command that seems almost liturgical. Around the walls they go, once each day, then 7 times on the 7th day. The ark turns the entire battle into an acted confession. Israel does not conquer the land as though it were another empire, at least in the narrative's ideal form. It receives what God gives and loses what God withholds. That ideal is fragile. The ark's presence does not guarantee success when the people are corrupt or presumptuous. The Bible is careful on this point. Israel can march with holy objects and still stand under judgment. The object does not erase the moral condition of the nation. This is one reason the ark remains so difficult to classify. It is tangible and central, yet it resists every attempt to be used as a mechanism. It cannot be reduced to symbol, because events cluster around it with real consequence. But it cannot be reduced to instrument, because it refuses human control. In the sanctuary itself, the ark carried the deepest memory of Sinai. The covenant tablets were not merely legal documents. They testified that Israel's relationship to God was spoken, commanded, and morally structured. Ancient kingdoms stored treaties in temples because gods were thought to witness political bonds. Israel's covenant went beyond politics, yet the treaty background helps make sense of the ark's role. The chest held the testimony of an agreement that defined the people's identity. To rebel against the covenant was not simply to break a rule. It was to betray the very relationship that made Israel Israel. This is why later writers can speak of the ark with reverence that goes beyond liturgy. It embodied a history, exodus, revelation, wandering, entry, promise. It also embodied a problem. How can a holy God dwell among a stubborn people without consuming them? Priestly theology answers through sacrifice, mediation, blood, and boundary. Prophetic theology later answers through judgment, repentance, and renewed hearts. Christian theology will answer through Christ. Jewish tradition, in its own path, will continue to wrestle with presence, law, and temple memory after the ark is gone. But while the ark still stood in Israel's midst, the question remained visible in wood and gold. It was carried through dust, guarded by linen and law, and feared because it brought the nearness of God too close to ignore. Chapter 4. The first great collapse in the ark's story comes when Israel tries to turn holiness into strategy. In 1 Samuel 4, the people are at war with the Philistines, one of the strongest regional powers pressing Israel in the days before monarchy. The Philistines were not wandering raiders without culture. They were organized, armed, and politically serious. When Israel suffers defeat, the elders ask why the Lord has allowed it, and then decide to bring the ark from Shiloh into the camp, that it may save us from the power of our enemies. The language is revealing. They do not speak first of repentance, inquiry, or obedience. They speak of possession and outcome. The ark becomes, for a moment, a battlefield asset. The camp erupts when it arrives. Israel shouts so loudly that the earth rings. The Philistines hear the noise and fear at first, because they too understand that a nation's God can matter in war. Yet the story refuses to reward Israel's confidence. The battle goes badly. Many die. Hophni and Phinehas, corrupt sons of Eli, are killed. The ark is captured. No reader who knew the earlier wilderness tradition would miss the shock. The chest that led through the Jordan now falls into enemy hands. The symbol of divine presence does not protect a priesthood rotting from within, or a people treating covenant like a charm. The news kills Eli, and the birth of Ichabod gives the moment its name. The glory has departed from Israel. But even here, the story is more complex than a simple loss. The Philistines take the ark into the temple of Dagon at Ashdod, and there the biblical narrative turns almost severe in its irony. In the morning, Dagon has fallen face down before the ark. They set him up again. The next morning he has fallen once more, this time broken, head and hands severed on the threshold. The text does not need long commentary. The message is clear. The God of Israel has not become captive because his chest has changed location. The ark in foreign territory does not prove divine weakness. It becomes the site of Philistine humiliation. Plagues follow in Ashdod and in other cities to which the ark is moved. The exact nature of the affliction has been much discussed. And the biblical description has produced many theories. What matters for the narrative is that the Philistines conclude they cannot keep the ark. Their priests and diviners advise a guilt offering and a test. The ark is placed on a new cart with golden images of the plague, drawn by cows that have never been yoked and have been separated from their calves. If the animals go straight toward Israelite territory, the Philistines will know the disaster was no accident. They do. The cows turn toward Beth Shemesh, lowing as they go. This episode deepens the ark's meaning in several ways. First, it shows that divine holiness cannot be enclosed by national borders. The God of Israel acts in Philistine land without needing an Israelite army to defend him. Second, it strips away superstition from both sides. The Philistines cannot incorporate the ark into their own temple world. Israel cannot control it as a war object. Third, it introduces a pattern that will repeat. Whenever human beings presume on what is holy, judgment is close. That judgment falls again at Beth Shemesh. The details are difficult, and manuscripts differ on the exact number affected, but the point is not. Some of the men look upon the ark in a way the text presents as irreverent, and they are struck down. Their response is the right question at last. Who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? That is one of the governing questions of the Old Testament. Not who can admire him from a distance, or invoke him when useful, but who can stand before him. The ark is then taken to Kiriath Jearim and kept in the house of Abinadab. Eleazar is consecrated to guard it. There it remains for years. Even as Samuel rises, Saul is made king, and Israel's political life changes. This period is easy to pass over because the ark seems still, but the stillness itself says something. Sacred things can remain in obscurity while history moves around them. Not every holy chapter is full of spectacle. Sometimes the ark waits while a nation learns, slowly and painfully, that no institution, shrine, or king can replace fidelity. In documentary terms, this long pause matters because it bridges two Israels. One is tribal, unstable, and threatened. The other is beginning to centralize under monarchy. The ark belongs to both, yet fits neither neatly. It outlasts corrupt priests. It resists enemy possession. It survives national humiliation, and all the while it keeps pressing the same uncomfortable lesson. God's presence is not absent from history, but it is never available on demand. The ark can go into battle, but it is not a battle plan. It can dwell among the people, but it is not tamed by dwelling there. It can be carried, but not handled casually. Those who forget this tend to learn it the hard way. Chapter 5, when David decides to bring the ark to Jerusalem, he is doing more than arranging a religious ceremony. He is shaping the heart of a kingdom. Jerusalem has recently become his capital, politically useful because it lies between northern and southern tribal interests, and had not previously belonged to one tribe alone. To bring the ark there would link throne and sanctuary, kingship and worship, national identity and covenant memory. From one angle, the move is wise statecraft. From another, it is a genuine attempt to place the kingdom under the rule of Israel's God. The two dimensions are not easy to separate, and the biblical narrative does not pretend they are. Yet the first attempt fails almost at once. David gathers chosen men. The ark is set on a new cart, and Uzzah and Ahio guide it. The choice of cart is revealing. It repeats the Philistine method, not the Mosaic instruction. What foreign pagans used to return the ark is now adopted by Israel's king. The procession is full of music, movement, celebration, and sincerity. None of that prevents disaster. When the oxen stumble and Uzzah touches the ark, he dies beside it. The text says the anger of the Lord breaks out against him. Modern readers often recoil here, and not without reason. The scene is severe, but the narrative is not teaching that good intentions erase sacred command. It is teaching the opposite. David's response is layered. He is angry. He is afraid. He asks, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" That question is not unbelief. It is the rediscovery of scale. A king who has fought lions, giants, and armies suddenly realizes he cannot simply incorporate the holy into his public triumph, so the ark is diverted to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it remains for 3 months. There, instead of judgment, blessing follows. Once again, the ark resists predictable use. It wounds in one setting and blesses in another, not because it is erratic, but because human approach has changed. When David tries again, he does so differently. Chronicles emphasizes that the Levites must carry the ark as Moses commanded. Sacrifice accompanies the movement. The king dances, not in polished royal distance, but with abandon before the Lord. Michal despises him for it, seeing indecency where David sees humility. The tension between them is not merely marital. It reveals 2 visions of kingship. One guards dignity from above. The other risks dignity beneath a holiness greater than the crown. David's dance has often been sentimentalized, but in context it is an act of reordered power. The king is not the center while the ark enters the city. He is for once displaced. Jerusalem's significance deepens here. The city becomes more than an administrative capital. It becomes the place where covenant memory, priestly service, royal aspiration, and national worship converge. Yet David is not permitted to build the temple that would permanently house the ark. The reasons the biblical books give are theological and moral. David is a man of bloodshed. The temple, in this telling, will belong to the reign of his son. That restraint matters. Even David, the Yutzing, does not control the timing or terms of the sanctuary's completion. Still, he prepares for it. He gathers materials, organizes Levites, and imagines a future he will not personally finish. This too belongs to the ark's story. The object that once traveled through desert camps now points toward a settled house in a royal city. But the transition is not merely architectural. Israel itself is changing. Tribal confederation is giving way to centralized monarchy. The danger is obvious. What begins as devotion can harden into political theology, where the presence of God is assumed to guarantee the security of the state. The prophets will later challenge that illusion fiercely. For now, the narrative holds both hope and warning together. The ark's arrival in Jerusalem is therefore not a simple victory scene. It is a test of whether kingship can kneel. David does kneel, at least for a moment. He learns that enthusiasm is not enough, innovation is not enough, and national celebration is not enough. Sacred order must be honored. This is why the memory of Uzzah remains inside the joy. Jerusalem receives the ark, but only after the king has been taught that even he cannot improvise the terms of holiness. There is a larger irony here. David, who would become the model king in Israel's memory, is not shown mastering the ark. He is shown being corrected by it. That is one reason the story retains its power. The chest of acacia wood and gold moves through history, like our judgment on every human attempt to make God an ornament of success. It enters the city on the shoulders of Levites, not as a trophy of empire, but as a reminder that the throne above the cherubim outranks every throne built by men. Chapter 6 Solomon gives the ark what the wilderness generation never had, and David could only plan for: a permanent house. The temple in Jerusalem rises through international trade, royal labor systems, skilled craftsmen from Tyre, cedar from Lebanon, and years of organized construction. This is no tent in motion. It is a monumental statement of settled worship and royal stability. For Israel, the shift is enormous. The God who traveled with the tribes in the desert now places his name in a city of stone. Yet the older tabernacle logic does not disappear. It is translated upward into a grander scale. When the temple is finished and the ark is brought in, the scene in 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 5 is saturated with liturgical weight. Priests carry the ark into the inner sanctuary, the most holy place, beneath the wings of large cherubim. Sacrifices are offered in such quantity that they cannot be easily counted. Then the cloud fills the house of the Lord, so that the priests cannot stand to minister. The language deliberately echoes Sinai and the tabernacle dedication in Exodus. The God who descended in fire and cloud has accepted the house built for his name. Yet even in this climax, Solomon acknowledges a paradox. Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. The temple localizes presence without limiting God. Inside the ark, according to 1 Kings, were only the 2 tablets of stone that Moses placed there at Horeb. This does not necessarily cancel all later associations with manna and Aaron's rod, but it does show that by Solomon's time the covenant tablets stand at the center of remembered identity. The temple, therefore, does not replace Sinai. It houses Sinai. Royal religion in Jerusalem remains answerable to the words spoken in the wilderness. That is the ideal, at least. Whether kings and priests live by it is another matter. At the heart of temple life stood ritual, and at the heart of ritual stood a problem no building could solve by itself: guilt. The Day of Atonement addressed that problem with unusual concentration. Once a year, as Leviticus 16 describes, the high priest entered the most holy place with sacrificial blood to make atonement for the sanctuary, the priesthood, and the people. This was not ordinary access. It was restricted, dangerous, and surrounded by purification. Later Jewish memory would preserve the gravity of that day with deep seriousness, because the issue at stake was more than individual cleansing. It was the continued possibility of divine presence among a sinful nation. The mercy seat on the ark's cover stood at the center of this rite. Blood was applied there not because God needed material appeasement in some crude sense, but because biblical theology binds life, death, sin, and holiness together in ways modern speech often avoids. Life belongs to God. Sin pollutes. Holiness burns. Sacrifice, however difficult to modern ears, was Israel's God-given grammar for approaching him without denial or destruction. The ark, hidden behind the veil, became the focal point where covenant law and covenant mercy met. Yet the temple's grandeur also carried a temptation. Once holiness acquires stone walls, priestly schedules, and royal patronage, people can begin to trust the system while neglecting the covenant that justifies it. The prophets will not allow that. Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up in the temple and is undone by his own uncleanness. Jeremiah later stands at the gate and warns against chanting the temple of the Lord, as if the building itself guarantees safety. The ark's history had already taught that lesson in mobile form. Now the temple age must learn it again on a national scale. This is why the period of the monarchy cannot be told as a clean ascent from tent to temple. Splendor comes with compromise. Some kings reform worship, others corrupt it. Foreign alliances bring foreign cults, high places persist, priests serve, but prophets challenge. The ark remains in the inner sanctuary, mostly hidden from view, while the nation around it oscillates between fidelity and revolt. In later generations, the chest that once led battles and crossings becomes less visible in the narrative, almost as if its silence is part of the indictment. Israel has not lost the symbol, but it often loses the obedience the symbol demanded. Even so, the temple period leaves one lasting impression. The ark is no longer only a memory of migration. It is the still center of a mature national worship. Pilgrims come to Jerusalem. Sacrifices rise. Songs are composed. Kings pray. Priests minister. The covenant has a house. And yet the deepest truth of the ark remains unchanged. The holy presence in the inner room is still gift, not possession. The cloud can fill the temple, but the Lord is not contained. The law can rest within the ark, but the nation can still break covenant outside its doors. The entire temple order lives under that tension. It is magnificent, it is fragile, and history will prove how fragile it is. Chapter 7. At some point, the ark disappears from the historical stage. The Bible never gives one clear, final scene in which its fate is fully resolved. That silence has created centuries of speculation, treasure stories, political claims, and legends stretching from Jerusalem to Ethiopia and beyond. But the canonical texts themselves are more restrained. They offer hints, later memories, and a widening emptiness. By the time the Second Temple stands after the exile, the Ark is no longer described as resting in its old place. The inner chamber exists, but something essential is missing. How it vanished is uncertain. Some propose it was taken or destroyed in the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Others suggest priests hid it before the city fell. A later Jewish tradition preserved in 2 Maccabees says Jeremiah concealed the tent, the ark, and the altar of incense in a cave on Mount Nebo, to remain hidden until God gathered his people again. That tradition is meaningful, but it is not the same as the earlier Hebrew historical books. The Bible leaves the matter unresolved. Historically responsible narration has to stop there and admit the limit. The Ark mattered immensely, and yet its final physical location remains unknown. That uncertainty is itself revealing. Israel's faith survived the loss of the object around which so much of its earlier worship had turned. Exile forced a rethinking of presence. Could the God of Israel still be worshipped without land, king, or temple? The prophets answered yes, though not cheaply. Ezekiel sees the glory depart and later return in visionary form. Deuteronomic theology explains national catastrophe through covenant breach. Priestly and scribal traditions gather memory, law, lament, and hope into texts that can travel where the Ark cannot. The people do not forget the sanctuary, but they learn that God's rule is not exhausted by one piece of sacred furniture, however central it once was. When the exiles return and rebuild the temple under Persian rule, the structure is humbler. Older men weep, remembering the former house. Later Jewish sources note several things absent from the Second Temple compared with the first, and the Ark is among the most significant. The Day of Atonement continued, but the old inner center had changed. An empty space can preach as powerfully as a full one. The absence of the Ark became part of Israel's spiritual landscape, a wound and a discipline. The people waited, prayed, studied, argued, and hoped under foreign empires, without the old sign of enthroned presence in the Holy of Holies. This is the point at which later interpretations begin to move in different directions. In Jewish memory, the Ark remains bound to temple longing, divine kingship, and the hope of restoration. In Christian reading, especially in the New Testament, the Ark's meaning is taken up into a larger claim about Jesus. John speaks of the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us, using language that recalls tabernacling presence. Hebrews reflects at length on sanctuary, priesthood, blood, and access to God, presenting Christ as high priest and his self-offering as the decisive act to which the older rites pointed. Paul can speak of Christ as the place of atonement in terms that echo mercy seat imagery. These are theological readings, not archaeological reports, and they should be described honestly as such. What matters is that both traditions refuse to treat the Ark as a curiosity. Its disappearance does not shrink its significance. Instead, it deepens the question of how God is present with his people. The biblical story had always insisted that the chest of wood and gold was meaningful because of what it represented: covenant, holiness, judgment, mercy, enthroned invisibility. Once the object is gone, those realities do not vanish. They become more, not less, urgent. There is also a political lesson in the loss. Any nation can be tempted to confuse divine favor with institutional permanence. Israel, temple, priesthood, sacrifice, monarchy, and memory. None of those prevented judgment when covenant collapse became systemic. The absence of the Ark after the exile stands as a warning against triumphal certainty. Holy things can be lost. Central symbols can pass out of sight. A people may have to learn again that what sustains them is not possession of sacred objects, but fidelity to the God who first gave them meaning. And yet the Ark's disappearance is not only a note of grief, it also prevents idolatry of the past. If the Ark had remained visibly accessible through every century, it might easily have become the object of endless manipulation, tourism, power struggle, or superstition. Instead, it vanishes into silence, and silence forces interpretation. The old stories remain, the laws remain. The memory of cloud, blood, covenant, and warning remains. But the object itself withdraws, as if to insist that no physical remnant can bear the full weight of what the Ark always signified. Chapter 8. In the end, the Ark of the Covenant tells the story of a people learning that the presence of God is the greatest gift and the greatest danger they can know. It begins in a wasteland among former slaves and ends in mystery, somewhere beyond the reach of history's firmest records. Between those 2 points, it crosses rivers, circles cities, humbles idols, corrects kings, sanctifies temples, and disappears. At every stage, it exposes the same human instinct, to want God near, but near on our terms. The Ark never allows that. Its lessons are older than monarchy and larger than archaeology. It teaches that freedom without covenant becomes drift. It teaches that worship without reverence becomes presumption. It teaches that religious symbols without obedience turn into props. This is why the stories surrounding the Ark remain so hard-edged. Uzzah dies. Beth Shemesh mourns. Eli falls backward in shock. Even David, beloved king and poet, is forced to stop and ask how holiness can come near without consuming him. These are not accidents of tone. They are the Bible's way of refusing to let familiarity replace awe. At the same time, the Ark is never only a sign of threat. The mercy seat belongs to it as truly as the warning does. The same object that marks boundaries also marks reconciliation. In priestly thought, blood placed at the point of divine enthronement makes continued life with God possible. Law inside the chest and atonement above it belong together. Command and mercy are not rivals in the biblical imagination. They meet in the same sacred space. That is why the Ark could be feared and loved, hidden and sought, guarded and celebrated. Historically, the Ark also reveals something unusual about Israel. Among the peoples of the ancient Near East, most nations built their religious world around visible images of divine power. Israel built its central shrine around a spoken covenant and an empty throne. Cherubim spread their wings above, but no idol sits between them. The invisibility is not a lack, it is a declaration. The God of Israel is present, yet cannot be pictured, carried, or controlled like the gods of surrounding empires. This made Israel vulnerable to misunderstanding, but it also gave its faith a fierce internal discipline. The unseen king could not be reduced to an object, even by the people who bore his ark. For later Christians, the ark's meaning does not end with its disappearance. It is gathered into the claim that in Jesus, God's presence comes near in a final and personal way, not through a gilded chest behind a veil, but through a life, a death, and a resurrection proclaimed as the fulfillment of law, priesthood, and sacrifice. That is a confession of faith, and it should be named as such. But it is not an arbitrary one. It grows from patterns already planted in the Hebrew Scriptures: holy presence, mediated access, covenant written and embodied, mercy at the center of judgment. The New Testament does not speak much about the ark directly, yet its sanctuary language shows that the old symbolism still lives. Even for readers who do not share that Christian conclusion, the ark remains a profound witness to how ancient Israel understood God, community, memory, and moral order. It stands at the crossroads of ritual and history. It belongs to priests and warriors, to wilderness nomads and temple builders, to grief and celebration alike. Few objects in biblical literature carry so much meaning while remaining physically so small and narratively so guarded, and perhaps that is fitting. The ark was never meant to satisfy curiosity. It was meant to teach a people how to live before a holy God. The modern search for its location often misses that point. The deeper question is not where the wood and gold may have gone, but what the stories still insist upon. That God is not absent, that He is not manageable, that memory matters, that obedience matters, that mercy is costly, that a people can lose their center when they treat the holy as useful, and that every age, ancient or modern, must decide whether it wants a God who can be displayed safely, or a God who speaks, commands, forgives, and overturns the terms of human control. So the ark passes out of sight, but not out of meaning. Its shadow stretches from Sinai to Jerusalem, from priestly blood to exilic longing, from empty sacred space to later claims of divine presence in flesh and spirit. It leaves behind no simple moral and no neat ending. It leaves a harder inheritance: reverence without superstition, memory without idolatry, hope without possession. That may be why the story still endures. Not because a lost relic continues to tempt the imagination, but because the ark, even in absence, keeps pressing the oldest biblical question back upon the listener. If the living God truly comes near, how then shall anyone stand before him? And if he also makes a way for that meeting, what kind of life could possibly follow?